Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Di from Wild Harvest School of Self-Reliance and enjoying some time in the garden with these lot. I've got some ducklings, if you can see them. Hey, it's alright. So we're going to start with a story. I always start my wild food walks with a story. So once upon a time, where our ancestors where our supermarkets and our takeaways are today, our ancestors would have had to hunt and gather for their food. And up until recently, well, about 15 years ago, hunting and gathering was a romantic notion of the past. It was a subject for historians and anthropologists. But over about the last 15 years, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in gathering, or foraging as we call it today. So we're going to start by looking at some of the reasons, some of the social, economic, some of the political and some of the environmental reasons that over the last 15 years there's been a resurgence of interest in foraging. Because basically these translate to the advantages, the reasons why you should learn about foraging. So the first is that over the last 15 years or so, there's been rises and falls in the economy, peaks and troughs. So when times are hard, people are often looking to tighten their household economic belts. And one of the main advantages of learning to forage is that it's free food. The caption of my wild food walk is join us to learn how to get free greens for life. I don't know if anybody's got a copy of Richard Maybe's Food for Free book. It's a classic kind of 70s hippie Bible. It's been out a long time, but Food for Free was a book out by Richard Maybe. So the first advantage of learning to forage is that we're surrounded by free food. The second advantage, or reason why people may have come to want to learn about foraging again over the last 15 years, is when you think about the supermarkets we talked about at the beginning, think about the veg aisle. You've got the likes of white cabbage, you've got iceberg lettuce, little gem. They're basically just kind of cellular water holders. There's very little nutrition. They've been bred over the years for our increasingly insipid tastes. But if you look outside at the wild plants, they're all dark green, glossy, and the root structure is always much, much deeper. If you think about lettuce and cabbage, they don't really need to send down very deep roots because they always receive a top dressing. Really, they get their nutrients from the farmer from above, whereas wild plants have had to optimise to survive without any input from humans. So how they do that is they dig deep down into the earth to draw up the minerals and the goodness. So in drawing them up, they then become accumulated in the plant themselves, and they can be called dynamic accumulators. Dynamic in that they're drawing up the goodness from the earth and then accumulating it in the plant. So when we come along and eat that plant, it's absolutely mineral rich. Think in terms of iron, copper, calcium, potassium, phosphate, magnesium. They're absolutely cram-packed with lots of the things that aren't available in the supermarket lettuces. So health, so it's free. The second reason is it's really, really healthy, and it's healthy in two ways, not just the type of plant that it is, but also it's healthy in how fresh it is. The supermarket veg could have been in transit for a couple of weeks, and during that time you get nutrient depletion, especially vitamin C. So with oxidization, with time, with heat, the nutrients in that plant will become less anyway. So wild food is really healthy in simply the time it takes to get to your plate. It's managed to retain all of the optimum nutrition. So it's free, it's healthy in two ways. The third reason that we might have started foraging more over the last 15 years is we're very interested in kind of sustainable living these days. We all want to try and reduce our carbon footprint, and part of that is eating locally. We're aware of the food miles on our plate. So of course with wild food you can't get much closer than the few metres to the village green. So it's free, it's healthy in the type of plant it is and how fresh it is. It's also uber local, so it suits our desires to live sustainably. The fourth reason that I think people have come to be interested in foraging, and that's that have we got any gardeners there? Does anybody grow vegetables? Annual vegetables particularly. If so, you'll know how labour intensive growing your own can be. If you're growing your own annual veg, you've got to plant the seeds, you've got to water it, you've got to pot it on, you've got to plant it out, water it, weed it. And then after a couple of months you might have a variable harvest. So next door's cat might have dug it up, the pigeons might have got it, or the weather. So in permaculture, growing annual veg is what we would call potentially high input, potentially low or variable output. Whereas with wild food foraging, all you do is you pick up your basket and you jump straight to harvest. So it's not about being lazy, because we live in a time depleted society now. We've got to work a lot more hours just to live, but the appeal of still kind of picking our own veg is there. So foraging suits that need. It kind of cuts out all of that having to grow your own, and we can still harvest our own. So it's easy gardening. And the fifth and final reason why I came to it about 20 odd years ago, and why I think a lot of people are getting more interested in foraging, because we've got the internet now. We're very, very aware of what's going on in the world, and we have this kind of intuitive feeling that we need to future-proof our family, future-proof our food supply. So if we think about those supermarkets that we talked about at the beginning, they operate on what you call a just-in-time stocking system. A just-in-time stocking system. Which means that really they only stock enough food for a couple of days. They no longer have the big warehouses out the back that they once had. So what would you do then if there was a climatic disaster, civil unrest, economic breakdown? What would you do if the supermarkets shut down? So I think one of the main reasons a lot of people are learning to want to forage is to future-proof your family. So we've looked at the advantages. We all know, we should be foraging. But like all good things, it comes with some caveats, and that's what I'm always really passionate about telling people at the start of my walk, that we have this process we can go through. So we'll talk about some of the caveats first, and then we'll talk about how to avoid them. So the first caveat for foragers is the law. Now the law affects foragers in three ways. The first is the law of theft. We are actually protected by the Theft Act 1968. We are allowed to forage without being prosecuted for theft. So I think the law says something like, a person who picks a wild plant on any land, even if they're not in possession of that land, cannot be classed as stealing. However, if they do it for reward, i.e. if they sell it or they turn it into a saleable product, then they can be charged with theft. So the idea is that you can forage for yourself, but you can't forage to sell without having the landowner's permission, or that would be classed as theft. So you've got theft. Then you've got the law of trespass, because it's all right to think, all right, the farmer can't get me for theft, I'll go and take what I want, because he can get you for trespass. And what can happen if a farmer approaches you when you're foraging on his land, he has the right to ask you to leave, quote, at the nearest reasonable exit. So you can't kind of dilly-dally off through his land, he can ask you to leave at the nearest reasonable exit. So the law of trespass affects us. The third way the law affects foragers is the law of conservation. Some plants are protected by law for their own, against us for their own good, and it's the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, and the list of plants is regularly updated, every couple of years, and that list is held in Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. But as relatively new or even intermediate foragers, I wouldn't worry too much about having to look at that if you stick with the kind of common plants that are around us. The other piece of legislation that plants are protected by is the European Habitats Directive. Both of these are available online on the government website. So the first caveat is law. The second caveat is conservation in its own right, because we care even about the common plants. Nature-based cultures know this, and they know never to strip a resource dry, because if you go out and take 100% of the flowers or the berries, then obviously there'd be nothing left. That's the plant's reproduction system, so there'd be nothing left for next year, nothing for the bees, nothing for the birds, and nothing for yourself for the future. So never ever take more than 10 to the maximum of 30%. But if you're going for 30%, somebody else might come along and think the same. So always think about the plant's kind of, future. So conservation in its own right, because we care. The fourth caveat is pollution. Now I know a lot of people think, oh yeah, I wouldn't forage from the side of roads, I wouldn't forage on industrial estates. So obviously we're aware of urban pollution is what I'm saying. We're aware of urban pollution because plants breathe in toxins and they accumulate them. But also in the countryside, farmers spray their fields, and if you're ever out for a walk and you see a field with the thistles and the dock leaves, they're looking pale and spirally and droopy. That field's probably been sprayed with herbicide, so you might not want to forage the hedgerow around that field. However, I wouldn't worry too much. In a survival situation, bearing in mind it's a cumulative build-up of these kind of toxins. It's not instant toxicity. So the benefit from eating fresh fruit versus the toxins, even in an urbanised area by a road, I think would outweigh the disadvantages of the toxins. It's the cumulative effect over a long time. So pollution is the fourth caveat. The third caveat. The fourth one, of course, is identification errors. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie Into the Wild, but it shows how even somebody who's been foraging for a while can actually mistake two plants. There's many plants out there where there is a deadly version and a very similar edible version. So what I'm going to do now is talk you through a process of how to avoid identification errors. When I tell my students, when I teach them foraging, I always say have at least 3 books, and make sure that those 3 books have photographs of the plants rather than artists' illustrations, because however beautiful the artist's illustration is, it's quite a quantum leap for the brain to make when you're looking at a plant in real life. So I always recommend 3 books with photographs, and you want to see the plants that you're interested in, you want to be able to see them at all different stages of their life cycle. So that's the overwintering rosette, with the leaves of this kind of basal rosette can be very, very different. And then as it grows, the upper leaves, so you want to be able to see photographs of the plant in all of its different stages. The other thing about the books is when you've got these books and you go out, don't just go for visuals, okay? It's easy to go out and see a picture in your book and see the picture in the wild and think, yep, that's it. However, there was a young boy up at Bottom, the community that I used to be involved in, and he was from Australia, and he took his friends out over the moors, the North Yorkshire moors, and he found foxglove, and he told his friends, we eat this all the time in Australia. He thought it was comfrey, and he ate it, and he ended up going to hospital to have his stomach pumped out because he just went for the visuals of the leaf. So what I tell my students is, don't just rely on visuals, you need to control for other variables. So in the book it will probably say the habitat as one variable to control for. So in the book it might say this is a plant of arable, or this is pasture land, this is a woodland plant, or it likes compacted soil. So check the habitat of the plant you've actually found to see if it matches. The other variable to consider is height. The plant you found in the book might have leaves that look like the plant you found in the wild, but it could be totally different height. It could also be out at a different season, so consider seasonality as a variable. See what what time of the year it's meant to be out. So with those variables in mind, you've controlled for those, you've gone out, you've got your book, you've seen your plant, you've controlled for these variables, you still don't tuck in. Firstly, there's the other senses. Other than just your eyes through to your brain, we've got other senses. Like people often say to me, how do I tell in early spring the difference between the wild garlic when it's pushing through and say bluebell or lords and ladies? So obviously we've got the sense of smell. Kind of start smelling plants. Does it smell like it's described as tasting or smelling? So you've got your sense of smell, your sense of touch. I mean, one of the ways of differentiating some plants is that some have a ribbed stem and bristly, while others are smooth. So don't forget your other senses as well. So you've got to control for all the variables, smell it, feel it, and even then you're not going to eat it. What you're going to do now is do what we call a 1 mouthful test. We used to say, like nearly 20 years ago, we'd say rub a plant wherever you would put perfume, so kind of here or here or here. However, if you did that and you got a reaction, is that necessarily a test, an accurate test? Because if we did that with thistle, or if we did it with nettle, it would sting, so we would think we couldn't eat that. So stop telling people to do that, and instead move to the next part of the taste test. So take a piece of the plant and prepare it in the way that it says the plant needs preparing. So if it needs to be cooked, cook it. Then just take 1 mouthful of that plant and just rub it on the inside of your bottom lip, because that's a place of maximum absorption. Anything rubbed there will enter the bloodstream quite quickly. So just rub it, that's it. Wait for 20 to 30 minutes. If you have no reaction, have 1 mouthful of the plant. Wait 20 to 30 minutes. And only then, if all of your controlling of variables in the book and your sensitivity test, your action test, then assume that your identification is correct. Okay, do not just rely on visuals, and definitely do not rely on memory. So with that in mind, I always tell people as well to start small. It's very easy to be overwhelmed. There's a lot of fear about starting a journey into foraging because there are so many plants out there, so many different ways to use them. So I always say, give yourself permission to start small. In permaculture, there's a principle: small and slow solutions are more sustainable. So rather than take on a 25-acre field and expect it to look amazing instantly, work on a small area. Choose 5 plants this year if you're new, and I'm still adding 5 plants a year to my repertoire. So the idea is choose 5 plants this year and only work with those to the exclusion of all of the others. And make sure that those plants are plants A, that you think your family will like the taste of. So there's no point in thinking, right, I'm going to start with Jack by the Hedge if your family don't like garlicky tasting things. So it should be something you think your family like the taste of. Secondly, it should be accessible to you. You shouldn't have to jump in a car and drive or walk up a mountain to get it. So accessible. And thirdly, it should be easy to prepare. It shouldn't be one of the kind of plants to start with that need double boiling or tannins leaching out. So when you've decided on those 5 plants, learn to use them in every which way possible. Fresh, dried, in lots of different recipes, and just forget about the rest. Then the next year, add another 5, and so on. And trust me, small and slow solutions are more sustainable. It will all stay in there and it will stay in here. So, small and slow solutions. Let's wait for my son to go. Now, the other thing is, I'm a big believer in wild food being for the common man. I find it very, very offensive when I see places like Epping Forest stripped for the wild food to end up on the plates in posh restaurants. One of the reasons I just charge about enough for a family as if they were going to the cinema. It's like a family should be able to come on a wild food walk just as if they were going to the cinema. I don't believe in charging like £60 a ticket. This is common food for the common man. And I think one of my passions is to demystify the subject, the kind of preparation of it, because I think when we think of it on posh plates in posh restaurants, it's a little bit inaccessible. And you don't have to think that, oh, this particular plant goes with this particular recipe, or a subtle hint of this. I find that offensive, and it's totally pointless, and it stops you starting. I believe it should be incorporated into simple family meals, and that the nutrition should be optimised. That's where I come from in my book, rather than fancy recipes. So with that in mind, I'm very keen to teach people about general processing methods, that you don't have to just think, oh, this plant needs this plant needs that. As long as it's an edible leaf, you can make a pakora with it, blitz it into a soup, steam fry it. You can make pakora with it. Okay, so don't get stuck in this mindset of, oh, it's chickweed pakora and dandelion flower tempura, because you can use any edible flower for your tempura, and you can use any green for your crisps, for example. You know, we looked at oak leaf crisps. But I also mentioned it could be any edible leaf. So you could have nettle leaf crisps, lime tree leaf crisps. So the idea is, don't get stuck with this mentality of the kind of the posh restaurants and the fancy recipes are giving you. If it's edible, you experiment with it in any which way you want. So the other thing is, so with edible flowers, again in my book, I talk about general processing methods for those. So any edible flower can make, you can infuse it in cream to make a custard, so like a wild floral custard. You can then turn that custard into ice cream. To make custard, by the way, it's just 4 egg yolks, 100 grams of caster sugar and some warm cream. Beat it all together, and you would have infused the wild flowers in the cream. So you might see recipes saying like, oh, meadow sweet ice cream, but you can do that with elderflower. You could do it with any flower that you wanted. Now, the other kind of concept that I want to make people aware of, other than just it's food for the common man and some general processing methods, is I'm quite impassioned about don't boiling your berries. I know lots of people like making jam and cordials, but in my book there's a chapter called Don't Boil Your Berries, and I was interviewed on BBC Radio a few years ago, and that was what I called it. I just told everybody, please think twice when you're making jams and cordials. There's many other ways to preserve the goodness in the wild harvest. Again, in my book I'll outline some of these other methods, but it occurred to me about 15 years ago when I was living off-grid in the caravan, and I was looking down at this big pan, doing my usual, because I always made rosehip syrup, elderberry cordial. My family seemed to be really active today. And And I looked down at the pan full of white sugar boiling away, and I thought, I'm nuking the goodness out of this. And I've never made another jam or a cordial since. There are so many better things to do with your berries, trust me. Vitamin C is not heat stable. So I'm passionate about telling people not to boil their berries. And the other thing as well is that, are you aware that I'm a wild food walk, so I like to show people the native spices. I know when you think about spices, it's easy to think, oh yeah, exotic imports. You know, we think in terms of cardamom, clove. However, a long time ago, we actually used our native spices commonly, and they only went out of fashion because with the Romans bringing imports in, everybody wanted to aspire to the kind of lifestyle of imports. It was seen as a bit of kudos. So we lost touch with our native spices, and they're only just kind of coming back into fashion again. But we actually do have spices over here that have the same chemical compounds in those that we import. So for example, who likes cloves? Anybody like cloves? The chemical in cloves is called eugenol. I'm never sure whether I say these phytochemical names right. Eugenol. Now, we have that in wood avens root. The plant wood avens is also known as herb bennet. It's got quite dry, crispy leaves, which you can also eat. But the root of that, a traditional recipe, was 15 grams of grated clove root, grated wood avens root to flavour apple pie. So that's our native clove taste. The other native kind of spice taste we've got is hogweed seeds. I love hogweed. I'm on a one-woman campaign to save the reputation of hogweed, but we could maybe talk about that another time. Now, hogweed seeds are tiny little, about 5mm discs at the top. When they're green, if you just taste one as a wayside nibble, it tastes like a cross between washing up liquid and orange peel. So I know I'm not selling it. But when they're dried and brown, if you kind of grind them up, you get if you think of that taste that I've just described, it goes really nicely with chocolate mousses or milky puddings, or even in savoury dishes. And then the other native spice we've got is ash. You know, ash keys, the dangly ash keys. Well, if you leave those on the tree for about 9 months, often they're still there and they're brown. So if you take those, by the way, one ash tree can yield about 6, nearly 7 kilograms of ash key seeds. So you can take these dried seeds, and if you just eat it, or I used to make a chai. It has a cardamom type taste, and I've made ash key seed chai, which is really delicious. So yeah, so again, that's another thing we do not need to import. Last week I was telling you about how with toiletries we don't need shea butter, we don't need cocoa butter, we don't actually even need spices, we've got them in our country. So, getting back to our ancestors then, so they didn't get their food from supermarkets or the restaurants that we talked about at the beginning. No Domino's, no Tesco. So the ultimate self-reliant skill is the ability to supply your own food, to be self-reliant in food. Now, in the book, my book, Barefoot Self-Reliance, I talk about this threefold food security system. So that's one part is foraging, but there's not just foraging in there, there's lots of other things like garden critters, freshwater critters. So you've got your hunting gathering, but you also need to have grow your own as well. And then you've got this third part, which is the kind of kitchen side. It's the bulk buying, the preserving, the baking from scratch. So you need to kind of have all of these three skill sets. So one of my questions for you today was, and you can answer in the comments later, is where are you on this journey? Where are you in that kind of Venn diagram? Where are you within the foraging circle? Are you just starting your journey? Are you already well on your journey? Tractors. So just tell me in the comments below, because that way if there's any newbies and anybody that wants advice on some things that would help them on their foraging journey, and then other people are already on their foraging journey, it just sets a little bit of dialogue up. Because like I say, this really is information for the common man. It's to help people future-proof their families. So it's about kind of sharing. So if you've got some things to add in the comments after, let me know where you are on your journey, and then we can see if we can get some dialogue going. So I think that's about it for today. Yeah. So I'll say goodbye from the ducklings as well. Oh, next week, by the way, I'm going to say bye. As you can see, they've pooed everywhere. They're really messy. Next week, we've got Paul Dorr talking about doing his learning to start working with leather talk. So he's going to talk you through all the things that you would need to get, the kind of tips to look for. things that you can make for starting. He's also going to be producing his own range of patterns soon as well, so you can buy a pattern and you can make things up at home. So yeah, let me know what you're up to with regards to your foraging in your comments, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, bye.